Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Israeli generals want a truce, but Netanyahu does not. So the New York Times reported on Wednesday that Israel's top generals want a ceasefire in Gaza, even if it keeps Hamas in power, putting them at odds with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The report, which cited current and former security officials, said one reason Israel's top brass favored a pause in Gaza was so that the Israeli military could recuperate to prepare for a full-blown war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. They also believe a ceasefire in Gaza could reduce tensions on the Israel-Lebanon border and make it easier to reach a deal with Hezbollah, although we have seen Israeli officials say that if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, that means they'll escalate in Lebanon. The Israeli military also believes that a deal with Hamas is the best way to safely free the remaining Israeli hostages, since Israel dropping bombs and starving people is leading to the death of Israeli hostages. So they quoted former National Security Advisor Ihel Hulata, former Israeli National Security Advisor. He said, quote, "The military is in full support of a hostage deal and ceasefire," end quote. So Netanyahu did not like this report. He responded to it, and he vowed that military operations in Gaza will continue until Hamas is eliminated. And this is a goal, remember, that the Israeli military, not just in anonymous comments to the media, but the Israeli military has publicly said they don't think Netanyahu's goal is achievable. So Netanyahu said, quote, "I do not know who these anonymous sources are, but I am here to make it unequivocally clear. This will not happen. The war will end once Israel achieves all of its objectives, including the destruction of Hamas and the release of all of our hostages," end quote. So 4 senior Israeli officials who spoke with the Times agreed that a hostage deal that keeps Hamas in power for now is the least worst option for Israel at the moment. So I think this is important because these are the Israeli generals, the people who are supposed to be executing this goal of eliminating Hamas. And they're saying that the least worst option for Israel is a deal that keeps Hamas in power for now. One thing that Hulata made clear was that they're not thinking of, a permanent ceasefire. He said, quote, "They believe that they can always go back and engage Hamas militarily in the future," end quote. So, and I just mentioned a little bit about that ceasefire deal that was on the table that President Biden unveiled. Just the really important point about it is that Israeli officials said that it was vague enough that they thought they could enter the first phase of the deal with Hamas, which is a 6-week ceasefire and initial hostage and prisoner exchange, without actually committing to a permanent ceasefire. But then you had Netanyahu out there publicly saying that he was against the idea of a permanent ceasefire. So that led to Hamas asking for stronger guarantees, which Israel rejected. So he sabotaged the deal by doing that. Yet you have Blinken going around saying, no, the only thing standing in the way of a deal is Hamas. So important. And again, I mean, it's just incredible that the U.S. continues to give Netanyahu everything he wants, even when his own military is against his plan here to some extent, at least. And there's no sign, that the ceasefire negotiations are really going anywhere or at the moment, unfortunately. All right, so the next one here, and this is what continues to go on in Gaza. Family slaughtered by Israeli strike in the so-called safe zone. So 9 members of the same family who evacuated Khan Yunis were killed by an Israeli airstrike on Tuesday in an area of the central Gaza city of Deir al-Balah that Israel declared a so-called safe zone. And this was reported by the Associated Press. So this is a family of about a dozen people, the Hamdan family, who just fled Khan Yunis. Israel ordered the evacuation. They fled in the middle of the night. They went to the north to stay with extended family members, and most of them were slaughtered. And this is one of the areas that Israel claimed was safe. And according to the UN, this evacuation order that Israel gave impacted about 250,000 Palestinians, and many of them were people that fled Rafah, people that have been displaced multiple times. So a total of 12 people were killed in this strike in Deir al-Balah, including 5 children and 3 women. And Israel has repeatedly bombed areas that it declares safe in Gaza, including the al-Mawasi camp on the coast, and that's where Israel told the people in Khan Yunis to go. So after Israel ordered the evacuation of Khan Yunis, this was, I believe, early Tuesday morning, kind of overnight airstrikes that they launched in the city killed at least 9 people, including 3 children and 2 women. The strikes were launched near the European hospital, which is also in the area Israel said should be evacuated. So patients and workers fled from the European hospital, which at the time was the largest operating hospital, one of the last functioning hospitals in Gaza. They had to evacuate. The head of the nursing department at the hospital told the Washington Post, quote, "Some of the patients were dragged in hospital beds toward Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis by their families. Some of them were transported in ambulances, and some of them went on foot," end quote. So just more of this attack on the healthcare facilities in Gaza, and this type of stuff, these slaughters of civilians continue as long as this thing is going on. All right, so the next one here, staffer resigns, says working for Biden makes you complicit in genocide. So this is an article from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Another U.S. official has resigned from their post over President Joe Biden's support for the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. A dozen members of the administration have publicly resigned in protest of the White House's assistance to Tel Aviv and signed a letter blasting the president's policy. Maryam Hassan Nain, the third political appointee to resign from the Biden administration, told HuffPo, quote, "I came to understand that even if the agency I'm working at is not producing foreign policy, serving in the administration in any capacity does essentially make you complicit in the genocide of Palestinians," end quote. Hassanein served as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management in the Interior Department. She's only 24 years old, and she represents the large number of young Americans who believe Israel's treatment of Palestinians in Gaza amounts to genocide. She was an enthusiastic Biden voter in 2020. So at least 12 U.S. officials have resigned. 12 U.S. officials have resigned publicly. And I know Josh Paul, who's the first one to resign way back in October. He resigned from the State Department. He says that there have been dozens of others who have left, but just didn't do it publicly, and that there are many people. There's a lot of dissent within the State Department, within USAID, within the other departments, even the Pentagon, to some extent. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu risks Lebanon war for political survival. So a former U.S. military intelligence analyst has warned that Israel is risking a major war in Lebanon for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political survival. So this is former U.S. Army Major Harrison Mann, and he's the one who resigned from the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency earlier this year. I believe it was in April, and then he made it public in May. So this is someone who was just in the Pentagon, in intelligence, and he says some really interesting and very concerning things here. So he spoke to The Guardian, and this is talking about the chances of war in Lebanon. He said, quote, "We know specifically that the Israeli prime minister must continue to be a wartime leader if he wants to prolong his political career and stay out of court. So that motivation is there, end quote. And his comments echo a report from the Washington Post that was published at the beginning of the year. And that said U.S. officials were concerned that Netanyahu might view war in Lebanon as key to his political survival. And again, at the time, Mann was in the Defense Intelligence Agency. He said he expects Israel to target residential areas in southern Lebanon in the event of a full-blown war, a tactic known as the Dahiyah Doctrine, named after a neighborhood in Beirut that Israel bombarded in 2006. He said, quote, "It's not like an actual written doctrine, but I think we can be very comfortable assessing that bombing civilian centers as a way to compel the enemy is clearly an accepted and shared belief in the IDF and Israeli leadership. We've just seen them do it in Gaza for these past 9 months." End quote. He also warned that Hezbollah would be able to hit back hard against Israel. He said, quote, "They probably have the ability to at least partially overwhelm Israel's air defenses, strike civilian infrastructure around the country, and inflict a level of destruction on Israel that I'm not sure Israel has really ever experienced in its history. Certainly not in its recent history," end quote. So this is the really concerning part. He said that if there was a heavy bombardment of Israeli cities, if they were really being, destroyed and taking serious damage, that would make it likely that the U.S. would get directly involved. He said, quote, "Our least escalatory participation will be possibly striking supply lines or associated targets in Iraq and Syria to help cut off lines of communication and armaments flowing to Hezbollah. But that on its own is risky because if we start doing that, some of the people that we hit could be Hezbollah, but they could be IRGC," end quote. And he's referring to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And he's saying that's the least escalatory option that the U.S. might take in the event of this war, which, U.S. is claiming that it's trying to avoid this war, but also kind of, in a way, kind of shrugging its shoulders and saying that war, it's moving in that direction, and giving Israel all the support and sending these warships to show Hezbollah and Lebanon that the U.S. is going to back Israel. So Mann said that he did not expect the Biden administration to target Iran directly, talking about like strikes on Iranian territory, but he warned that the risk of a direct U.S.-Iran war would increase significantly. He said, quote, "I trust the administration not to do that, but I think between us or the Israelis striking Iranian targets outside of Iran, the risk of escalation is also going to get much higher," end quote. So, yeah, I mean, this is just like, if this war breaks out, there's so many ways that it could escalate into something even bigger. I mean, it's going to be devastating enough, a full-blown war in southern Lebanon and, Hezbollah's response to it. And the next one here, Hezbollah says that a Gaza ceasefire is needed to end conflict on the Israel-Lebanon border. So the deputy leader of Hezbollah reiterated on Tuesday that attacks on northern Israel would only end if there was a ceasefire in Gaza. So this is Hezbollah Deputy Secretary General Sheikh Naim Qassem. He said, quote, "If there is a ceasefire in Gaza, we will stop without any discussion. If what happens in Gaza is a mix between ceasefire and no ceasefire, war and no war, we can't answer how we would react now because we don't know its shape, its results, its impact," end quote. So basically saying if there's a formal ceasefire, we'll stop. If things wind down and they kind of pause, and Israel doesn't withdraw from Gaza, then we'll see. And the issue here is that we, as I've been talking about a lot lately, because it's important, we've seen Israeli officials say, I haven't seen it so much recently, but they've said that if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, they're going to escalate in Lebanon. And that first story I went over, you have these Israeli generals saying one of the reasons why they want a ceasefire in Gaza is to prepare for war in Lebanon. So if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, that doesn't mean that there's going to be peace on the Israel-Lebanon border. So he's also warning that Qassem said he doesn't believe Israel has the ability to launch a full-scale assault on Lebanon at the moment. and warned that if there is a limited incursion, it could result in major regional escalation, basically saying there's no, warning Israel that if you try to do a limited thing, you don't know what it's going to turn into. He said, quote, Israel can decide what it wants, limited war, total war, partial war, but it should expect that our response and our resistance will not be within a ceiling and rules of engagement set by Israel. If Israel wages war, it means it doesn't control its extent or who enters it, end quote. So referring to the possibility of other parties entering the war. So according to a tally from AFP, Israeli strikes on Lebanon since October 7th have killed at least 493 people, including 95 civilians. On the Israeli side of the border, at least 15 soldiers and 11 civilians have been killed by Hezbollah fire. So a lot of people, nearly 500 in Lebanon now, have been killed. And the strikes continued on Tuesday. All right, so the next one here, Ben-Gvir is adamant of using the death penalty to clear prisons. So this article is from the Palestine Chronicle. Israel's far-right national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has reiterated the death penalty for Palestinian detainees as a much simpler solution to overcrowding in Israeli jails, as officials continue to trade accusations over the issue sparked by the release of the director of Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. So the director of the Al-Shifa hospital was arrested by Israel, and he was just released after months of being in captivity. And everybody, Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, all these Israeli officials are furious that he was released. And they're saying, he was released because the prisons are too overcrowded. Shin Bet, which is the Israeli security service, is saying that Ben-Gvir and other Israeli government officials are ignoring the overcrowding problem. They say there's like 22,000 or something Palestinians locked up in these jails. And Ben-Gvir is saying the solution is death. We should kill them. And he also goes on to explain some of the things that he has done in his role as the Minister of National Security, like depriving Palestinians of food, lowering how much food they give them, basically making the conditions worse for the Palestinians. He put out this lengthy statement on X. So he said, quote, since I assumed the position of Minister of National Security, one of the highest goals I have set for myself is to worsen the conditions of the terrorists in the prisons and to reduce their rights to the minimum required by law. Everything published about the abominable conditions of Palestinian detainees was true. He said that they ruled the prisons without question and did whatever they pleased, end quote. So he's saying that before he came in, the Palestinians in prison could just do whatever they want. And he's saying, and one of the things that he says he did, and I went over a story about this the other day, is cut down how much food that they give them. So this is the guy, again, they try to frame Ben-Gvir as some sort of fringe figure, but he's literally in charge of this stuff. And these are people that they detain, they could detain for any reason, like the director of the hospital, and claim that they're suspected of being a threat to national security or whatever, or suspected of being terrorists. And we've seen all these stories of torture, brutal torture, rape in these prisons. And the next one here, Israeli forces are detaining pregnant Palestinian women. This article is from the New Arab. So the Israeli army has detained at least 2 pregnant women in Damun prison since October 7th, according to the Palestinian Commission for the Affairs of Prisoners and Ex-Prisoners. Writing on Telegram, the group stated that the 2 women, Jihad Nakla and Aisha Gidhan, are among 7 detainees currently under investigation by Israeli forces. Overall, there are currently 78 female detainees in Damun prison, including 3 from the Gaza Strip. The group also revealed that the women are subject to abuses, including starvation and isolation. The group said, quote, they have been completely isolated from the outside world and deprived of their simplest rights, such as clothes and medical care, in spite of the seriousness of health conditions for those who have chronic diseases. Furthermore, they are subjected to physical abuse and suppression since the beginning of their arrest, in addition to sexual harassment during strip search and other threats, end quote. So this is just an example of some of the people that are in these prisons. 2 pregnant women, at least 2. All right, so the next one here, Hungary's Orban visits Ukraine and wants a ceasefire. So Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban made his first wartime visit to Ukraine on Tuesday and suggested Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to agree to a ceasefire with Russia. Zelensky's so-called peace formula, which he has been pushing as a way to end the war, requires a full Russian withdrawal from Ukraine before negotiations can even happen, which of course is a non-starter for talks with Moscow. Orban said he told Zelensky that he should consider agreeing to a ceasefire first. Orban said, quote, this was at a press conference with Zelensky after they met. He said, quote, I asked the president to think about whether we could reverse the order and speed up peace talks with making a ceasefire first. A ceasefire connected to a deadline would give a chance to speed up peace talks. I explored this possibility with the president, and I am grateful for his honest answers and negotiation, end quote. So a Ukrainian official, the deputy head of Ukraine's presidential office, later said that Zelensky dismissed Orban's proposal. He said, quote, the president of Ukraine listened to him, but in response, he stated Ukraine's position, clear, understandable, and well-known, end quote. So while Hungary is a NATO member, Orban has been one of the most prominent European critics of the proxy war in Ukraine. He has repeatedly delayed EU aid packages to Ukraine and softened some sanctions on Russia. I think it was the gas and the oil. He got exemptions for the Hungary and the other landlocked countries because they rely on pipelines, and that's not something you can just change quickly. So Orban also does not allow his country's territory to be used to transfer weapons to Ukraine. So since February 2022, Orban has consistently called for peace talks and a ceasefire in Ukraine, putting him at odds with the U.S. and other NATO countries. The U.S. has discouraged peace talks throughout the war, including in March and April of 2022, when there was a real peace deal on the table, when there was a real chance that they came to an agreement. The U.S. discouraged Ukraine and said, no, don't worry, keep fighting. We'll give you the money. We'll give you all the weapons. And look where we are over 2 years later, how many people have been killed. All right, so the next one here, Austin says that the U.S. will give Ukraine a new $2.3 billion weapons package. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin hosted his Ukrainian counterpart in Washington on Tuesday and said the U.S. would soon announce a $2.3 billion weapons package for Ukraine. He said, quote, I am proud that the United States will soon announce more than $2.3 billion in new security assistance for Ukraine, end quote. He said it will include air defense interceptors, anti-tank weapons, and other munitions. This will be provided through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to give Ukraine weapons straight from Pentagon stockpiles. They could ship them over there right away. Austin also vowed that the U.S. would continue supporting Ukraine and fueling the proxy war. He said, quote, Ukraine is not alone, and the United States will never waver in our support. Alongside some 50 allies and partners, we'll continue to provide the critical capabilities that Ukraine needs to push back Russian aggression today and to deter Russian aggression tomorrow, end quote. Austin's meeting with Umerov comes about a week before the U.S. will host a NATO summit in Washington from July 8th to July 11th. Umerov said that he hoped Ukraine would be invited to join NATO soon. He said, quote, we look forward to discussing with you how we could continue our partnership and be in the future a member of NATO, hopefully soon. Ukraine will receive its invitation, end quote. And there's no indication that Ukraine's going to get an invite to join NATO anytime soon. That deal that Biden and Zelensky signed last month kind of repeated this vague promise, not even a promise, just this vague statement that NATO made about the issue at their summit last year in Vilnius. It said that Ukraine would be invited to join when allies agree and conditions are met. So about as vague as you can get. And Zelensky was very unhappy with that last year. But with this NATO summit, we're not expected to hear any new major announcements. I think Stoltenberg's trying to get the alliance to agree to this big package, like commit a certain number of military aid, a certain amount of military aid each year, but not clear if that's going to happen. All right, so the last story here, China and the Philippines hold talks on the South China Sea. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and as we've been covering on this show, tensions have been very high in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines. Lots of encounters at these disputed reefs and rocks, mainly at Second Thomas Shoal, where that's the one where the Philippines has a ship grounded there that they use as a base, and China blocks their boats from resupplying it. And this is the U.S. is completely intertwined in this, threatening that if this thing turns hot, the U.S. is going to intervene. So it's a complete mess. So it's good that there's talks happening. So Chinese and Philippine officials met to discuss the South China Sea on Tuesday, even as Beijing accused Manila of undermining peace and stability in the disputed waters. Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manola confirmed the talks, the first of their kind since January, were taking place in Manila, and said he was hoping for the best. So not really many details on this, but just the fact that they are having conversations. There was an incident, I believe, just last week. There was another one of these standoffs that they had. So again, tensions are still very high, and the U.S. is really emboldening Marcos in this dispute. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ramsey Baroud on aid and war, how Israel has used starvation to subdue the Palestinians. One from Edward Hasbrook, a war draft today can't work. Let us count the ways. One from Caitlin Johnstone at her website. Former Israeli Prime Minister admits Israel's war crimes can't happen without U.S. support. So this is important. This is about Ehud Olmert, former Israeli Prime Minister, and he's come out very strongly against Netanyahu. And one of the reasons why is because he's damaging the relationship with the U.S. I'll read this quote from this op-ed that he wrote for Haaretz. He said, quote, "I accuse the Prime Minister of Israel of a deliberate attempt to destroy the political security military alliance between Israel and the United States. For many years, Israel's political stability in the international arena rested on the absolute support of the United States. The entire Israeli Air Force relies completely on American aircraft, fighter planes, transport planes, refueler planes, and helicopters. All of Israel's air power is based on the American commitment to defend Israel. We have no other reliable source for essential supplies of equipment, munitions, and advanced weapons that Israel cannot manufacture on its own," end quote. So saying the Israeli Air Force, the one that has just been obliterating Gaza, is entirely reliant on support from the U.S. And this is why Americans should care and must oppose U.S. support for Israel. So go check that out. One from Ted Snyder, the 3-hour coup. What just happened in Bolivia? There was apparently an attempted coup, but now people are saying that the president set it up himself. So go check that out from Ted Snyder. One from Joseph Solis Mullen, the Libertarian Institute. Washington is sprinting, not sleepwalking, into war with China. So please go check all of that out. You could always support this show by sharing it, like, subscribe, comment. I appreciate everybody that comments and interacts and shares this show. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on X and all that stuff. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.